Hello there everybody, Sam's Trains here, welcome back to the railway and welcome to another 3D printer review. Today we're going to be finding out whether this absolute beast of a 3D printer is any good at making models. A little while ago I was contacted by Qidi technology to see if I wanted to review one of their 3D printers. Now, as you know, I often turn down free review samples, but on this occasion I decided to accept it. Now, you guys know my reviews, you know that I'm honest in my reviews. I'm not in the business of making adverts, and if a product doesn't meet the mark then I will tell you about it. So that is absolutely the case today, but bear in mind I didn't pay for this printer. Also though, it's going to be really handy to have a third machine up here in the loft to help out with all of my various projects, and most importantly this is yet another machine that I can test to see whether it's any good at making models. I've already looked at two machines. I've looked at the Mingda Magician X and also the Flashforge Adventurer 3. Both of these are great printers and they've both produced some pretty good results, but neither of them are perfect, so I'll be very interested to see how this thing compares to them. So let's get started then, shall we? Now, I wanted to give you the full unboxing experience, but as you can tell from the size of it, not the easiest thing in the world to unbox. And in fact, the box it came in was so big that it didn't actually fit up the loft. So I've had to take it out of its box already, but this is what the box looked like. Yeah, it's a very, very big thing. Let's talk about this printer then. So the printer is the Qidi iMate S, and it's currently available on Amazon at the time of filming for £469, which makes this the most expensive of the printers I've tried so far. So let's talk about the features then. So this is a direct drive printer, which means there's no Bowden tube like this, the Adventurer. The system that drives the filament forwards is all in the Extruder, so that's pretty good. According to the listings, it has an all-metal frame, which is obviously good quality. That'll be nice and sturdy. And as you can see, the printer also has an enclosure around it for temperature control, so hopefully that will keep temperatures constant, which is obviously what you want. The really interesting feature is that you actually have a choice of extruder. So this does come with the standard 0.4mm extruder assembly, which most printers have, but it also comes with a 0.2mm extruder, which is obviously much finer. So for fine work, that sounds quite handy. I have heard horror stories about the smaller diameter extruders though. I've heard they're quite prone to clogging, they're not as reliable, so it will be interesting to see how that works with this machine. Not sure if we'll get around to that today, but that's certainly something to test. The Amazon listing also says silent printing, so obviously that is something to think about if you're printing in your bedroom or something. I don't know, you don't want something too noisy. But elsewhere on the listings it does say 50 decibels is the noise level, so obviously that isn't quite silent. As you can hear though from this, it's not actually too noisy. I wouldn't say that it's silent, but it isn't too bad. It has a magnetic printing platform for easy removal, so that means you can get your models off it without too much of a faff. That's a good thing to have. And it also can print via Wi-Fi or via USB drive, so that's what you need to know. Okay, so I did film a little bit of the unboxing process, so let me show you some of that. The thing you need to bear in mind is that this printer is pre-assembled, and that's great for beginners. It means you don't have to worry about putting the thing together. But it does mean that the box is huge, like I say, absolutely gigantic. So if you've got very narrow doorways or a tight loft ladder like I've got, do bear in mind that you might struggle to get the box through some of those doors. And also, this printer is capable of producing some fairly large models. The print bed is 26 centimeters by 20 centimeters, so that's around the size of an A4 sheet of paper, and it's also capable of 20 centimeters in height as well. So it's a great print size, but it also means that the printer itself is pretty massive. So it is going to be non-trivial to find a good place to put this printer, so do bear that in mind before buying. Anyway, let's take a look at the instruction manual then. So we'll just flip through this very quickly. The first thing to say is that there is a multi-voltage power supply in this, but you do have to select the voltage. So you've got a choice of 115 volts or 230 volts. Make sure this is set correctly for where you are, otherwise you could blow up the printer. There's some good information about customer support there. You've got the kit contents, so you've got the printer inside there, the filament holder and gasket. You've got a power cable, screwdriver, that's a nice little freebie, user guide, I'm not sure why they put user guide there because we've got it in our hand, a USB drive, a 16 gig one, so that's pretty good. You've got a leveling piece of paper here, that helps with the actual leveling of the printer. You've got a big bag of spare parts, you've got a cover for the top of the printer, 2 side panels which are removable, and then of course you've got the 0.2mm extruder, which is a whole separate piece if you wanted to use that instead. Okay, next page, a little bit about getting to know your printer. We'll gloss over this. And then you've got the unpacking section here. So that's what we'll get onto in just a second. So it goes into quite some detail on how to unpack this. We'll talk about that in a second. You've got a bit of info on the display and the operator interface, no problem at all. This is the leveling section then. So this printer does not have any auto leveling functionality. You do actually have to do it manually, which in some ways is a bit of a faff. Obviously it's easier just to push a button and have the printer sort itself out. However, doing it manually means that the print bed is going to be actually flat, and the printer isn't having to level itself in software by varying the Z height. So I think this might actually be better, even if it's a bit more work to set it up to start with. Anyway, we'll try the adjustment in a little while. Filament installation, we'll do all of this later on, of course. Yeah, it shows you how to load the filament, no problem, and unloading as well. First print, there is a test print on the USB drive, so we'll see what that is. That's always fun to find out. And then you've got a bit of information on the slicing software, which I won't go into too much detail right now. I'll show you that later on. Right, so let's get into the unpacking process then, which you actually shouldn't overlook with this printer. I was quite tempted to scoff at the fact that the instructions went into great detail on how you remove the packaging from this thing, but seriously, it's actually important. It would be a real pain and a jigsaw to unpack this without the instructions, because there are all sorts of little hidden clips which hold belts together, different orders that you have to take things apart in order not to damage the thing. Yeah, it's worth actually just taking the time and doing this thing properly. So I managed to get all the film off, all of the different clips, the cable ties, the different bits of foam. In fact, in order to finish unpacking the thing, you actually have to power up the printer and raise the Z-axis upwards in order to get this tray out from underneath. So the first little box that comes out is the second nozzle. I think this is the 0.2mm nozzle, so I'll be able to try that at some point. And then you've got the accessories tray, which also comes out, and that includes absolutely loads of different accessories. So you've got the screwdriver inside there. That's really quite a nice little extra. You've got a glue stick. This is great. This is for helping adhesion to the build plate. That's always a great thing to have. You've got these 2 plastic holders. I think these are to hold a spool of filament. We'll figure out how that works later on. You've got this, the all-important USB drive. I think this has the software and such on it, but obviously later you can load models onto that for printing. You've got this is a scraper. Not a big fan of these. In fact, the first build plate I ever had, I ruined by scraping it after every print, but it's really handy to have one of these for those little stubborn bits of PLA that just won't come off. And normally you'd have to buy this as an extra accessory. You don't have to on this occasion, so that's fantastic. Look at this, you even get a proper spool of filament. It's only a small one, I think 100 grams, but there's more than enough there to get you started, which is very, very good. We're still not done. You've got this is the little sort of calibration card, if you will. It's the right thickness so that you can get the Z offset correct. Then you've got this, which I can only describe as a rolling pin, but no, this is the piece that actually holds the spools. It's made of metal as well, quite good quality. And then you've got an almighty parts bag, which with all sorts of accessories. You've got more of those bulldog clips, another screwdriver, you've got spare nozzles by the looks of things, there's a spare fuse inside there, Allen keys, or Allen wrenches as you might call them, little tubes for inside the extruder, loads and loads of stuff inside there. So you really are kitted out, and there are very, very few accessories, extra accessories, that you'd actually need to buy. I've also dug these side panels out of the bottom of the box. Not sure if these sort of text stickers are supposed to come off or not, but it doesn't matter too much. And I think they just snap onto the side with magnets. Yeah, they do. So that's pretty good. You've got easy access. Gotta say, first impressions, quite impressed with this thing. It all seems to be well thought out, seems to have everything you need. The thing lights up with LEDs when you switch it on. Seems so far like a quality item. But obviously, before I can say that for sure, I need to get this thing printing, I need to test it, need to find out how well it works. So even though this doesn't have any automatic leveling functionality, the leveling process doesn't seem to be too bad. You've just got 3 sort of nuts, 2 at the front and 1 further back that you can get the level right with. And then once those are all adjusted correctly, the final step is to adjust the Z value in software, and that just makes sure that the actual Z offset is set correctly. Now this printer works slightly differently to the other printers I've shown, whereby the X and Y movement is all done by the extruder and the print bed itself just moves up and down. So you've just got the Z movement on the build plate. And that is a little bit different because the build plate starts at the top and works its way down as the print continues. So normally on a more traditional 3D printer, increasing the Z value will actually increase the distance between the extruder and the print bed. Whereas here, increasing the Z value actually reduces the distance between the print bed and the extruder. So you do just have to sort of think about it for a second, otherwise you go the wrong way and you don't get the desired result. Anyway, time to move on. See these are the spool holding things. They hold the spool in place. They've even got a proper thread, you know, a proper metal or brass screw thread on that piece. So yeah, we're talking quality here. I did think, you know, ooh, £400, is it going to be a bit cheap and nasty, or is it going to be decent? Oh, it's decent. It seems very decent. So I've got to put my, yeah, I see, right. So the spool of filament goes onto the rolling pin, and then these things hold it in the position you want. I guess the idea is that you can have 2 different spools of filament sitting on this thing. Well, I'm not going to do that. We'll just have one, I think. And then there are these things, filament guides they call them. They look like little tubes. Again, good quality. I can see a little bit of metal in the end there. So I think these are supposed to go in here, but that is not going to fit. No way. Right, well, without the filament guide in place, the top cover isn't going to fit on properly, so I've taken my snips to this part here, and I'm hoping now I'll be able to fit this thing in place, hopefully. Right, I'm going to try loading the filament then. So I'm guessing we want filament. I'm looking at the instructions for this. Click on the number, and when the colour changes to red, it shows the temperature is rising. Okay, so the number. All right, and that's heating up to 220 degrees, which should be fine for PLA. So this printer is direct drive, which means we've got no Bowden tube or anything. It's just, you know, the extruder has the motor assembly inside it, and that's good. The best 3D printers are that way these days. It's now hit 220 degrees, so according to instructions, I put gentle pressure on the filament and then hit the down button. And I can feel the direct drive pulling the filament down. I don't think I have to keep pushing down like I did on the Minder. I think it's got it now, and it seems to be still pulling it, so I have to wait now until the filament arrives on the other end. Yeah, we're getting something. There it is. I put my own in. I've put some white in because I know it's good stuff. There it comes. Alright, so what do I do to stop it? That's probably what I need to find out. I'll let it flow through though for the time being, because it might as well flush out all of the red. Stop. There you go. So that's worked. Let's pull that away from there. Right, so now we are ready to print the test file. We've still got some gloop coming out of the nozzle here, but I've no idea what the test file is, but I'm going to put the USB drive in. I've no need to put the build plate on that I showed in the pack, because there's already one on here, so you've got 2, you've got a spare, so that's really good. Again, for your money, you do get quite a lot of extras and spares here, so that's good. It looks like we've still got some filament in the nozzle, but that'll clear through, I would think. Let's pull that out. Some of the red filament, that is. Okay, so let's find out how we go about printing with this thing then. So I'll shut the door. Right, well, there is a preview file on the screen. Which shows what the model's supposed to look like. But I still have no idea what it's going to print. What is that? I'm guessing we'll just have to find out, won't we? But here we go, it's going for its first print. It seems to be lowering the build plate down to the bottom. It hasn't heated up anything yet, so... Oh, I see, yeah, it's just homing itself before it starts. Fair enough. We have got the build plate temperature and also the nozzle temperature displaying on the screen, and I notice that they're wrong, so can I change them, I wonder? Yeah, it's only at 190 degrees, that's a bit cool for my PLA, and I don't think I can change them. So this probably isn't going to work very well. Yeah, it's too cold, that's not going to work, I don't think. So in that case, I'm going to cancel the print and I'll have to try something of my own to begin with, because the test file on the USB drive, yeah, the temperature is too low, it's at 190, and I don't want to print at 190. that's too cold for this filament. And I don't really fancy changing the filament. I suppose I could. But no, let's try slicing something for myself and we'll give it a try. Okay, so I've prepared a simple wagon body in the slicing software, and I'm going to pop that into the machine and get it started with that. And while everything warms up, I'll tell you a little bit about the included slicing software, but for now, let me grab these files. So I suspect that this slicing software is based on Cura. It has all of the same settings, works exactly the same, so it's very, very easy to use. I've put in all of the parameters that I would usually use to print my models, so layer height, wall thickness, all of that stuff. So hopefully this will be a good comparison to what my other printers can produce, and we can get a sense of the quality of the prints out of this machine. Now, I'm not using a particularly fine layer height here. I'm using 0.18 millimeters, which is fairly standard. It's not too low, but it's not particularly high. So this printer can obviously do much, much better than this. Just for a practice print, we'll see how this goes. So there is no glue on the build plate. There's a good chance I will need to use glue so that prints stick properly. But I'm going to try it without to start with. It did seem like quite a bumpy texture on the build plate, so maybe I won't need to use it. Maybe I will though. Let's find out. Let's see if this thing's going to work properly. So while that prints, I thought we would take a look at the other extruder that comes with this printer, just really to have a look at the sort of features and quality we've got on board. Also, I'm really interested to know whether the only difference between this extruder and the one on the printer is the nozzle diameter, because if there are no other differences, then this is a great spare part to have around. I've got a complete extruder assembly here, if so. Anyway, let's take a look at this thing. I'd be interested in the sort of quality that this is built with. First things first, it's a very heavy part. There's quite a lot of weight to it. Let's pull it out so we can look at this thing properly. So the first thing that is great about this is that I'm holding it here in my hands, and all of these little plugs are in place, and the only thing that connects this to the printer is this ribbon cable adapter here. So for serviceability, that is great. With the Mingda machine I actually have to unplug all of these connectors and pull the parts off individually. This extruder is one part, which is great. So you can see the fairly chunky stepper motor there, and that obviously drives the filament forwards. I don't think this is a geared extruder. It's not geared down for more torque or anything. I think it is literally a direct drive, but hopefully that won't cause any problems. I also like how close the extruder nozzle is to the drive motor. Having such little space between the two parts increases the level of control you have, so you don't have to have as much retraction during prints, which is good. Obviously though, good cooling is required for that, and look at the size of that heatsink right there. That is a very, very big heatsink there, I suppose to make up for the slightly small size of throat there, which is fairly small. And then you've got the hot end itself. These appear to be made up of standard parts. You have got some insulation around there. And then of course you've got the two cooling fans on board. So you've got this fan here, which presumably connects up to some sort of channel which cools the filament as it comes out the nozzle. And then you've got this second fan, which is a fairly good size actually, and that cools the area above the hot end, of course, the throat and such, just to make sure you don't get melted filament higher up in the system than it's supposed to be. Great size heatsink on that. So this is a very high quality piece. It looks sturdy, it looks serviceable, and the fact that you can remove it from the whole machine so easily is going to save a lot of time. Alright folks, the results are in. Here is the first ever print done by this machine. And it's absolutely fantastic. I don't know if I'm just getting luckier at picking the right settings, but this thing, in terms of the bodywork, is absolutely spot on. Very, very impressed with this thing. And get this, I did not have the jerk and acceleration controls enabled for this print. I forgot to enable them, and even so, I mean, the actual fidelity and the accuracy in the print here is 100%. I cannot see any imperfections in it whatsoever. Don't get me wrong though, even though the acceleration and the jerk do cause print times to increase a little bit, it's well worth having those enabled, if for no other reason than just to reduce the amount of force on the machine itself. Yeah, it's a good idea to have that enabled. The only problem with this print is that it was a bit too close to the build plate, and so you have got a bit of an elephant's foot effect around the bottom of the model, and that does mean that the holes for fixing a chassis are a little bit too small. Now with the Mingda machine, for instance, it was very easy to alter that during the print. You've got the nudge option so that you can just raise the extruder, a fraction of a millimeter or whatever. As far as I know, you can't do that with this printer. The only way to change the Z offset is to recalibrate it outside of a print, or there's a very handy Z offset value in the slicing software which you can change. So it's a little bit less convenient than the Mingda in that sense, but I'm hoping once I do get the Z offset right that it will cease to be a problem. So with that, let's get this thing printing again. I'm going to try a slightly more challenging model next. Remember that tiny little coach that I produced? Well, I'm going to try and print the body of one of those because it's got all sorts of overhangs and such for the windows, and the extruder has to move around quite a bit more on this one. It doesn't print every layer as a single piece. So we're going to try this one. I have made some changes. I've added acceleration and jerk control, and I've also modified, sorry, the beeping, I'll have to turn that off. I've also changed the Z offset, only by 0.03 millimeters, so not much, but I'm hoping that will make the difference. Who knows though, I might have to cancel it and readjust the Z offset so that it's right. I'm not even sure if I've adjusted the Z offset in the right direction, so it could actually be closer to the nozzle, which I don't want. So quite often people ask me about the print settings that I use for my models, so I am just going to use this opportunity to go through what I use. Now obviously every machine out there is going to be different, and I'm no expert, so what I say is not necessarily law, so don't be surprised if these exact settings don't work for you. However, I have used very, very similar settings to these on my FlashForge, my Mingda, and now the Qidi printer, and it's always more or less worked within a small margin of error. So let's take a look at this then. So layer height, this is basically the vertical resolution, if you want a simpleton term. I tend to use 0.18 millimeters. I find that this is a good compromise between quality and time. If you're doing really high quality components or you want a serious model done, I would suggest knocking this down to 0.12 or sometimes 0.08, which does a really good job. I think for my couplings and fine parts like that, I do use 0.08, but clearly it takes much longer. So for bodies and that sort of thing, I find that 0.18 does the job. Infill, this obviously controls how much of the empty space within a model is filled in with filament, and generally speaking I'll leave this at something low like 20% because 00 gauge models are not that large and the support structure on the inside is not that important, so 20% makes them nice and strong, but it does again keep the print time down. If you want your object to be heavy or particularly strong, then you can bump that up to whatever you want. You can have it even at 100% if you want, but 20 seems to be fine. Okay, extruder retraction. Now this can change greatly depending on the machine that you're using. I haven't touched this setting on this printer, but basically I've got 1.5mm retraction. But basically that means when the nozzle has finished printing a section and it needs to move to another part of the model, it actually pulls the filament back up inside the nozzle so that you don't get sort of oozing filament as it goes on its travels. And if you don't use this setting or the retraction distance isn't great enough, then you get stringing across the model. And if you've got a Bowden tube like the FlashForge machine has, it's going to be much higher, 6 or 7mm, something like that. So yeah, that's fine. So we've got layer height. Line width, I tend to leave at the size of the nozzle, so that's 0.4mm, and this is actually a really important one to think about in designing the models. So as you can see, this coach that I've got here, I didn't design that well because I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines and then a little bit of an infill in the middle there. Ideally, I would want to design models whose wall thickness divides exactly by 0.4, and as you can see, I didn't do that on this. So that is something to consider. It's not a problem. I mean, this coach prints fine, but yeah, there's just something that feels right about matching the wall thickness to the number of lines. Obviously, if you're designing components and that sort of thing, it doesn't matter too much, but for fine scale models, you want as much accuracy as you can. Wall line count, again, that's not too important because this is a very small object, but designing something larger, it can save time if you knock the wall line down. It's going to be stronger if you increase it, so I keep that at 3. Top layers, you can just leave that at 5 and 4. That's always served me just fine. Infill density, we've already talked about. You can change the sort of the structure on the inside of the model if you want. I don't tend to mess around with that too much. Additions, I always print with a skirt. So you can see we've got the skirt down here. This is just to make sure, well, I just use this to make sure that the extruder is actually extruding material before it reaches the model, because sometimes you've got air inside there and whatnot. So this makes sure that it's printing as it should. 2 lines is absolutely fine and 4mm is absolutely fine as well. I always print with a skirt. Okay, print speed. The lower the speed, the better the result, because like all jobs that are done too quickly, they can be done badly. But obviously then it takes a long time. So I tend to print with an outer wall speed of 40, inner 50, top and bottom 50, and the base layer, and this is a setting that you sometimes have to enable by going into expert mode, at 10. It is quite important to me, at least, that the base layer is print nice and slowly. And then the acceleration and jerk controls are always enabled for me. Printing temperature, this will depend of course on your filament. I use 210 degrees as per my filament, and for PL8 you're going to want to use a 50 degree or there around build temperature. Print cooling, you do obviously want to be cooling your print as it runs, but I start the print with a 0% fan speed and it ramps up to 100% at some point after the first layer. Generally you get better bed adhesion if there is no fan on at least the first layer, maybe the first couple, so that's why I do that. Z offset, for this printer it works out at roughly 0.03mm, adjusted by me, but obviously you'll want to play with that to get the right settings. So there we go, those are the basic settings that I use. I don't go too advanced with this sort of thing, but those are the settings that work for me, and those are the settings that seem to serve this printer quite well initially. Okay, so the coach body has finished. It took just 1 hour 56, which is actually slightly quicker than the slicing software estimated, which means that this printed exactly at the same rate as the Mingda machine, which isn't a surprise because I sort of copied the settings. Okay, so can you see this with the door open? Kind of. And of course the build plate is quite easy to remove, but the magnets are tougher than you expect, so it does kind of feel as though the build plate is not supposed to be removed, but it is. You just have to be firm and persevere and it comes off. Okay, let's try and get this thing off the build plate then. Now with this one it was quite difficult because I had it too close, I had the nozzle too close to the build plate. Hopefully that won't be the case on this one, but let's find out. I can just flex this build plate. Not sure if this build plate's supposed to be flexed too much, so I'll be quite careful with it. Alright, it is off. Let's have a slightly closer inspection then, shall we? And overall, this is looking really, really good. I can't see really any imperfections. Slight bit of ringing here and there, but really nothing too serious. And of course, when I put the primer on my models and paint over them, you can't see that anyway. But yeah, the actual detail here looks absolutely phenomenal. It's really, really good. A little bit of stringing between the windows, but nothing too serious. Yeah, overall, that is brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to do one more demonstration print in this video. I'm going to change to a black filament because I think that will allow you to see the detail a little bit better than the white. And I'm going to try and do a classic chassis. All right, I think we are done. Oh, nice. Right, let's pull off the excess. I will pull this off the print bed, and then we'll compare it with some very similar chassis produced by my other machines. I think that would be a good comparison. So there you have it, 3 very similar chassis printed on my 3 different machines. The one in the middle here was produced by the iMates. The one on the right hand side is a slightly different freight version of the same chassis done on the Mingda, and the one on the left is identical to the one I tried on the iMates, except that one was produced on the Flashforge Adventurer 3. And as you can see, the iMates efforts are pretty good. There is a little bit of stringing and over extrusion in a few places, so I might just have to increase the retraction slightly on that, but overall, the general shape is pretty good. You've got a slightly textured finish in places. There's a little bit of ghosting that is visible, but overall, it's a pretty good effort for an early test. Here's how the Flashforge version of the same chassis compares. This is better in some areas because it's got a much smoother finish. As you can see, there's no ghosting or anything. But if you look at the sort of suspension springs, if you will, yeah, they're a little bit messier on the Flashforge. If you look at them on the iMates, then yeah, they're a lot cleaner. And I still think the best is this one, the Mingda, which is crazy because it was a 200 quid machine, I think. I don't know if they're going to be changing the price on that though, so take that with a pinch of salt. Obviously though, that is a different chassis, slightly different design. But as an early test, the iMates is looking good. At the moment, not quite up to the level of the Flashforge Adventurer 3, but then again, neither was the Mingda chassis. When I first printed it, I do have to spend quite a lot of time experimenting and trying to improve things. But overall, it's looking pretty good to begin with. So of course, once I've had weeks and weeks to really get to know this printer, I'm going to be able to tell you much more about what it does well and what it doesn't do well. However, I've obviously spent enough time with it now to have a good sort of impression of what we're dealing with here. So here are my first impression pros and cons. So we'll start with pros, and the most obvious one is the high print quality. The very first print this thing did was great, and I haven't even sat down and tweaked the settings yet, so that's a very, very good sign. So this machine does detailing really, really well. This machine is better than both of my others when it comes to finer parts. Obviously though, the finish could be a little bit better because of all that ringing, and I'll talk more about that in the cons section, but the rendering of the small details is definitely the best of any printers I've tried. The next pro is that the critical components seem to be of a high quality. So you've got the very large diameter rails, which look good quality. The whole frame is a heavy metal construction, which is great. You've even got springs on the belts to keep them taut. That's really good. You've got a high quality extruder that we saw. Yeah, we know the components there are high quality, and everything works straight out of the box, which is always a fairly good sign of high quality. It's also got an enclosure around it, which obviously increases the space this thing takes up, but it makes for far better temperature control, which is always a plus. The machine is also direct drive with a very small distance between the stepper motor that drives the filament and the nozzle itself, so retraction can be kept to an absolute minimum. And of course, the sheer number of accessories included here means that despite the high asking price of the printer, there are very few extra things that you actually have to go out and buy to get started 3D printing. Here are the cons then. It's quite a big list of cons, but clearly these are not as critical as the pros were. So first minor con was that this printer has no auto leveling. Now I know auto leveling is a fairly new thing, but it was very, very convenient on my Mingda machine, which means the manual leveling on this machine is slightly detrimental to the ease of use. However, the manual leveling is not too much of a headache. It is fairly easy to do, albeit not quite as easy as having it done automatically. The quality of some of the non-critical components, the plastic casing for instance, isn't quite as high as the mechanical components. For instance, the moulding on some parts of the case was quite sharp and I've almost cut myself on it in places. And then there was that filament feeding slot, which did not accept the sort of filament feeder tubes. Yeah, that was a bit of a problem. I'd actually had to take my snips and a file to the printer in order to get those parts to fit. And it does seem like there's quite a bit of friction in the whole filament feeding system. Yeah, there's a lot of sharp angles that the filament has to turn over, which is not ideal, but it does seem to work okay. The next con is the size. Yeah, this is a really, really big printer, and that's a good thing in some aspects because obviously it can produce some pretty large models. However, it's not a particularly efficient design in terms of its size. I mean, it's very tall, the filament is in an awkward place, which increases the height quite a lot, and you've got that top piece, which is really tall. And then the gantry seems to be really, really wide with respect to the build plate, so it's a wide machine as well. It's not a huge deal, but obviously some people are limited on space, me included, and so this is a big space investment. The next con is that you can't make adjustments on the fly while things are printing. Now again, I know this is quite a niche feature, but I got quite used to having it on the Mingda machine and it's quite useful. So that means you can't adjust the Z value on the fly, the Z offset that is. You can't change the fan speed or the temperatures. It's not that common a feature, I know, but it is handy to have and this doesn't have it. Maybe a firmware update could improve on that. The next con is that the Z-axis is driven by just a single motor and a single threaded rod. Now I don't know how critical this is, but even my Mingda machine with its very light Z-axis assembly has 2 motors and 2 lead screws to operate its much lighter Z-axis. This obviously has a very, very heavy build plate which it's raising up and down. Now it's not as bad as you might think because obviously the print bed descends as the print goes on rather than ascends, so it's not as though the system is having to lift your print as you go, so that's a good thing. But I personally am going to clean that worm drive and re-lubricate it every single week because I do not want that thing to get dry and start to wear out. The next con is the ghosting that we've seen on some of the prints, and this does seem to be difficult to solve. I've now had time to sort of mess around with the jerk and acceleration settings. I've slowed down the print speeds. It just doesn't seem to go away no matter what I do. I think it's just because of the size of the extruder, and I even remarked on the extruder section on how heavy the extruder assembly actually is. It's quite a big heavy thing, and I just think that thing speeding up and slowing down constantly does cause vibrations and you get the ghosting. The good news is though that of course it's not visible when you put primer onto the models, so it's only sort of surface deep, it's not visible with a layer of primer on. So it's not a big deal for me, but if you want to produce naked parts and such, bear in mind you probably will see some of that ghosting. Okay, the next con is of course the cost. So this version, the iMates S, does cost almost £500, and certainly you do get what you pay for in the quality of the machine. It's got a lot of high quality features. However, the quality of the prints themselves are comparable to much cheaper printers. You know, it's comparable to printers that cost half as much. Yes, the detailing is a little bit better, but then the finish of the bodies and such isn't quite as good. So if you're looking to invest in raw print quality only, then this printer might not be for you. But if you want the full package, it's probably going to last a good while due to the high quality components, and you certainly get everything that you need, like I say, in terms of accessories. But at the end of the day, worth it or not, it's not an insignificant amount of money to spend on a 3D printer, so do bear that in mind. So thank you so much for joining me for another 3D printer review. I hope you enjoyed this one. This machine is definitely the highest quality 3D printer that I've had. It isn't perfect. There are 1 or 2 things that I would prefer to be better. It's really frustrated me that I can't get rid of that ghosting, but it was a big relief when I sprayed that coat of primer onto that coach body and saw it disappear, so that's a good thing. Thank you very much to Qidi for sending me this machine. It certainly will come in handy for my projects. And if you're interested in buying a 3D printer, obviously bear in mind the pros and cons of this one and make your decision wisely. But for now, thanks for watching and I will see you very soon. Alright, cheers folks.